Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending upon your time zone. Welcome to Successful Strategy, the May installment in the 2016 Nonprofit Leadership Development webinar series. Delighted that you are joining us here today to continue your own personal development and professional development, this month focusing on strategy. In preparation for our time together here today, please take a moment to close the door to those outside distractions and silence your electronic devices. Try and turn off those applications that might be on your computer, particularly those that let you know when someone else has tried to contact you. Also, please do get comfortable in your surroundings. There's some research I'm interested in learning more about that tells you sometimes you will learn better if you take your shoes off. So go ahead and get comfortable, kick your shoes off, and get ready to reflect on why you decided to invest time today in yourself, in your development, and in your own nonprofit leadership. Some of our logistics, attendees will be muted during our webinar today. If you're getting an echo, you may need to switch to a headset or to a telephone call in so that you can eradicate that feedback. If you want to keep me in tune with you, there should be a My Mood function or an interaction that you can choose from the top of your screen and let me know. Speed up, slow down, how things are going. And throughout the webinar today, if you do have a question, please use the chat function and send a message to me. It should pop up and we can address it in that moment or as the content goes along. So it is really important that today particularly you are prepared to type away and ask the questions that you may have about successful strategy. The topic can really go in a variety of different directions. So today we want to make sure even more so that you get the information that you need about successful strategy and how it relates to nonprofit leadership development. So with that, we'll dive into our content. A bit about me. I'm Melanie Schmidt, owner of Timpano Consulting. I've been working with nonprofit organizations for over 20 years, helping them to refocus, recharge, and reframe how they go about doing their business and enhancing their mission and fulfilling their vision. I do have experience across sectors, and particularly when you are thinking about strategy, that becomes quite advantageous to be able to see it from different perspectives and see how different motivations or different outcomes will influence that strategy development process. And above all, knowing that particularly when it comes to strategy, I am a learner and I am all about the practical. So we're going for some practical strategy tips today. And during our discussion, our goals, simplify strategy. Again, it can be a very elusive concept, an elusive idea, and something that there is a lot of mythology about and misunderstanding. So we're looking to provide some means by which to simplify that concept of strategy and then integrate strategic concepts, finding a variety of ways to bring the information together and make it real for you and for your organization and for your stakeholders. We'll also introduce some techniques and some questions that you can use to advance your own strategic thinking. And this might be at a programmatic level, at an organizational level, at a personal level as well. Really looking at how we can simplify strategy, integrate its concepts, and then advance our own thinking in this way. So in simplifying strategy, one of the things to know is that there are a lot of different ways to think about strategy. So here I'm going to encourage people to chat and think about this sentence. A strategic program is one that's consistently focused on the big picture. A strategic program is one that is consistently focused on the big picture. When you hear that sentence or read that sentence, what are the two words that suggest successful strategy? So take a moment, type that chat in, and again, think very specifically about the two words in that sentence that suggest successful strategy. And it's important when we think about this sentence and why we're looking at those specific phrases or words in the sentence is really because language is critical. And if you are advancing strategy within your organization or with a group of people, it's really important to understand that you all have to be clear and have a shared perspective about what strategy is and how it's going to affect your organization. And as we start to see things coming through on the chat, we're seeing a variety of words coming in, and that is exactly what we're speaking to. And for that, it's understanding again, when you think about a concept, starting with a shared understanding, that shared language is actually the basis of developing a successful strategy. For some of you, the key words in that sentence, big picture, came through. For others, strategic and consistently were identified as the two words. And through that, what we see as well is some of the challenges. When we think about strategy, we think about big picture. But when we see a strategic program, the key is that it's consistently focused. A solid strategy is something that allows you to understand a big picture, but in a way that allows you to act in a consistently focused fashion. And so when we think about that, successful strategy is really a guide. And it's a guide in a way that you can see either, if we think about it, that excitement, that flash in the pan, that fire gathers everyone's attention. It's exciting. Yet that's momentary. There's a flare up, there's excitement, there's energy, and then it subsides. Whereas successful strategy is really that guiding light. It's something that you see over the horizon, going over a period of time, and something that has a certain amount of consistency to it so that you can have consistent focus as you're lighting the way for your organization or for your program over time. Strategy, when you think about it in a very simplified fashion, really has you thinking about strategy as orchestration. It's less about big ideas. Certainly, you have to have the big ideas in order to have a successful strategy, but strategy itself is orchestration. It's really about choices that people are making, particularly choices that leaders or executives are making on how to play the game. So with that successful strategy, you'll have that big idea, that idea of where you're going to go and how you want to get there. Successful strategy and a successful strategist is the person who really starts to orchestrate who needs to be involved, what do we need to be considering in terms of risks, what are our opportunities, and it is about winning, and it's winning in a way that maximizes long-term value. A successful strategy is one, again, that's looking over the horizon and seeing how are you benefiting not only the organization, but also the key stakeholders. And so to keep that in mind, that it is much more about orchestration and activity and decisions and choices that leaders are making. Strategy, when you realize it, another way to think about it is that a successful strategy is the thread that really connects the intentions of the organization or the intentions of the leadership with the actions of the individuals who are representing that organization and the ultimate impression that's left on the stakeholder and with those who are involved in the process. And so a realized strategy is going to be one that considers that entire spectrum at the beginning of the process and the beginning of the discussion, so that you are, as Stephen Covey will say, start with the end in mind. Who are we influencing and how do we want to influence them? How do we need to act as an organization and as individuals to ensure that our intention mirrors the ultimate impression that we're making? And a good, solid, orchestrated strategy helps individuals within the organization or on the team know what decisions should be made at what times and toward what end. Another key component about strategy is that it's in the middle. We heard earlier that concept of strategy often affiliated with the big idea, but what this diagram seeks to represent is more of the process, and that your world will start with this idea about something that needs to be done, a social issue that needs to be addressed, or a community impact that's needed. And then you'll start that brainstorming process. This is actually the exciting part of the process that most people think about as strategy. But we aren't there yet. Brainstorming is really continuing to build those ideas, surface conversations, connections, relationships, risks, and opportunities that then feed into a planning component of your process, so that you're taking that information, distilling it, applying some filters and some clarity in terms of how aligned might that be with my mission? Will it advance our vision? Are we in a position to act on that with the resources we have? And from that plan, you're able to then think about orchestration. You're able to think about strategy. What are the decisions that we need to make? Well, how can we marshal our resources? Whom might we need to influence in order to act upon our plan in a successful way? So the strategy, again, is that orchestration, the decisions that the leaders are making about the allocation of resources and with whom. So that the strategy allows you to then prepare. You can take that idea that's been brainstormed, put into a plan, reinforced with strategy, and communicate to people what they need to do in order to move forward on that project or initiative. And that takes you into implementation, which leads to that exciting action, where again, it's the step by step, the piece by piece, the things that again have been orchestrated together so that you're prepared to go forward and launch, whether that's an initiative, a new idea, a new way of thinking. But strategy is in the middle. It's really at the heart of the matter for advancing critical initiatives for your organization. And in doing that, we think about strategy, driving clarity on all levels. And so there's the 30,000 foot view, the 10,000 foot view, 5,000 and 500 foot view that we may have. Represented in this diagram, there are the clouds in the sky, the real high level organizational opportunities and issues that exist. And that's really the strategic plan. Again, that high level plan, looking more at a longer trajectory, looking at a 3 to 5 year situation, and with a fewer number of metrics and other components. It's the idea of coming back to something, having your touchstones that then are drilled down into an implementation plan. We come out of the clouds and we start to go among the treetops and look in that 1 to 3 year horizon for if this strategic plan is how we're going to orchestrate our resources to advance our mission. The implementation plan becomes more of those specific actions that can be taken by the organization to advance its mission. And then you come down to that 5,000 foot view, or perhaps you're more at the tree branches. And at that point, you have a project plan. And that might be a 9-month plan. It could be a 1-year plan or a multi-year plan. But that's where you start to see a lot more of the project management techniques coming into place, where you're actually looking at timetables and who's going to do what very, very specifically, which then connects to that ultimate individual work plan that allows an individual, when you have strategy connected at all levels, it allows the individual with that work plan to see how they're advancing the long-range intention of the organization. And so strategy, when you take the time to really think about it, clarify it, and drive it home, provides clarity for stakeholders at every level of the organization. Because ultimately, strategy connects people. Strategy is orchestration of resources and decisions to advance initiatives and issues. And so one of the ways to remember how this plays in is that you can have a strategic framework that gives you a really exciting vision. You have a great idea of how you're going to address community impact or move things forward, has that compelling mission so people are very clear on the purpose for the organization and how they fit into the world, could even have some very clear goals and be very ambitious. but that's just a plan. You don't have strategy unless you have clear and coherent answers to 3 questions. And those 3 questions are very straightforward, and they are, to some degree, more marketing language. A clear strategy will identify who's the audience. With what we want to accomplish as an organization, who is the audience that we're affecting? Who do we need to engage? Who do we need to persuade? Who do we need to have on our side? Who do we know we need to overcome or neutralize because they're not thinking about this in the same way that we are? And then once you have that audience of thinking about how can we move our intentions forward, it's important to think about what is the value proposition to them. We often will think about moving things forward in the world from our perspective. And what's the value that this provides to me and my organization? But successful strategy will look at what's in it for the other individuals who may be involved or who may be impacted by the activities. And so for a specific target audience, so for instance, perhaps for donors to a specific initiative, what are they going to get out of the intended outcome? What's the benefit that they could reap? What's the value that they're going to see in that? And then as an organization, the third question is how can we deliver on it? It's understanding of your available resources, what your gaps are with those resources, also understanding where your critical connections might be. And a successful strategy is one that is going to make you stretch a little bit. A strategy that's in place that feels really easy and is 1, 2, 3, let's go, done, is not necessarily a successful one, because a successful strategy is building your organizational capacity, expanding the way that you're thinking about things, and moving the organization forward. And so when you have the strategic plan, remember that you need to step back and ensure you have a core strategy under there by knowing who all will be involved, who's affected, what matters to them, and then how can we deliver on it. Because ultimately, the successful strategy will drive decisions. That is what we want a successful strategy to do, is to provide a basis for clear and consistent decision making. A strategy that considers the intent, the actions, and the impression is one that will inform leadership goals. So you will be looking at the resources for the organization, the capacity that you have in terms of human capacity, financial capacity, social capacity, intellectual capacity, and then see where you need to grow the organization or what decisions need to be made so that you can, in fact, drive your resource allocation more appropriately and more sustainably. Because a successful strategy is one that helps focus those initiatives consistently in a way that allows you to filter ideas, engage which ones do we have the ability to take now, which ones might we need to plan for, which ones should we eliminate. Because ultimately, a successful strategy also gives you the rationale and the platform by which to say no, which is a really hard thing for many organizations to do, particularly in the nonprofit sector. We're used to saying yes and. We will figure it out, we'll make do. There's always that compulsion to fix and to enhance and to better things. And so a successful strategy will allow you to strategically filter which ideas you have the resources to focus on so that ultimately you can have continuity with your intent. It comes back to knowing the end game that you had in mind and how are you consistently behaving in order to achieve that for your organization. So those are some of the concepts that we have when we think about simplifying strategy. Really thinking about the orchestration as opposed to the big ideas, and also being able to think about how you're connecting that big picture to the very small component that needs to happen. And so when we integrate those concepts, what we're able to do is fit strategy into a framework. One of the questions that will often come up with strategic planning processes is what's a goal versus what's an objective, and where's the strategy fit in, and what is all that language? Started with language, we'll come to language here with that reminder that it's imperative that everyone has the same understanding of what's being put into that framework or that plan. And so you'll also see here that strategy, again, it's in the middle. You have that purpose, your ultimate intent, what you want to accomplish as a mission for an organization. Then you see your goals, looking out over the horizon or with that project. What is the ultimate accomplishment that will guarantee future success or secure that future success for the organization? With your objective, that's really leading into the goal. It's your aim, it's your action or series of actions that'll help you attain that goal. And again, the strategy, that's the means. That's really looking at, again, resource allocations across your 4 kinds of capital and the steps that need to be taken to connect what you would like to have happen with the actions that are being taken to move that forward and the ultimate impression that you're making on those involved and those affected. And then the tasks become those pieces of work to advance the strategy. And metrics are the way that you'll know whether it succeeds. So wanting to put that framing device in there, and it'll give you some tools for having conversations about which aspects of the plan are critical and reinforcing that strategy is, again, at the middle of the matter. There are some basic concepts as well for successful strategy, and this stretches across strategy, whether it's a governance strategy, a branding strategy, an organizational strategy. All concepts of strategy benefit from discipline, and that discipline is ensuring that you have milestones, focused conversations, follow-up, a distillation process, so that it moves beyond the idea and the brainstorm and the plan into the strategy of what decisions do we need to make to move this forward. Also, that successful strategy is clear and not complicated. When you have those strategic planning documents, which I have seen, that become more along the lines of books than chapters or reference documents, it becomes challenging to remain focused and have that consistent focus on what matters for the organization. So successful strategy is clear, it's concise, and it's not complicated. Because if it is a clear, successful strategy, it will give you a method for engagement. And that's in developing the strategy, ensuring understanding of the strategy, and actually implementing that strategy as well. And so having that method for engagement with all of those stakeholders. Remember, one of the critical questions to answer for a successful strategy is, who is our audience? Who's going to be affected by this? And how can we better understand what they need to know, what they see as value, so that we can then orchestrate the processes or the systems to deliver that value to them in a manner that's consistent with the mission and values of the organization. Another key concept for successful strategy is that it is built by the organization and it is shaped by stakeholders. And so this is where gathering input is vital, so that you have a clear understanding of what your stakeholders value and what they see coming out of the intention. But it is built by the organization. It's built by the experts, by the individuals who will subsequently be tasked with carrying forward that strategy as we go into tasking, working, ultimately taking action and implementation. Also important when we think about successful strategy is that it should be that common understanding of intent. A successful strategy, if it's helping you say no to things, it is a way of understanding where the resources are being allocated in your organization and what the priorities are. And so that you can have a foundation for a much stronger impact. You know, one of the challenges that we see, particularly in the nonprofit sector, is a lack of resources. We have people working way too much all the time. We're always on now, and that becomes really hard to have a sustainable impact. What a successful strategy can help people do is ask the question, if we have these 3 strategic tenets for our organization, how does this great new idea advance them? And then how do we know we have the resources that we need in order to move that forward successfully and sustainably over time? So successful strategy will give you that foundation because you'll have asked great questions and gotten a lot of information. And another key component is that it is also documented and distilled. We said earlier it should be simple. It should not be complicated. So it needs to be reductionist in nature, to take all of that brainstorming, put it through a plan, deliver a strategy for action and implementation, and then document it so that people can pull out that document as a reference over time and adapt it as necessary. Because the other thing that we know is the thing that is constant in our world is change. And so with that, really wanting to have that documented strategy as a guide for all individuals within an organization. Because when we have that, we have great opportunities. And so when we think about strategic planning and combining that planning with the strategy, moving it into action, we think about opportunities related to our people and related to our process. So for people, a big opportunity is how can the process of developing our strategy engage people and deepen relationships? Particularly within the nonprofit sector, deepening those relationships is critical. You want to deepen the relationships between coworkers so that they're all working toward the same goal and the same end, and they have that support and the trust so that people know what they're doing and why they're doing it. You also want to deepen those relationships with your clients so that you're getting instructive and insightful feedback from them about how the services and programs are meeting their needs. And the relationships with donors or other community partners, the process of developing a strategy and discerning your ideas is a great way to engage them over time. You can also look at it from the process perspective, and what do your people need to succeed throughout the process and at what pace? Every organization paces differently. For some organizations, when they're developing strategy, it is a fast and furious and all ideas in, all ideas distilled and out in a very short period of time. There are people who can process information very quickly. For others, they need to go through much more generative processes for that. And so they're actually pacing at a much slower pace, but one that allows their people to process the information and to really set people up for success with the process. Because when you're considering the people and how the process can engage them, you're also considering what your people need in the process, then you can think about that plan. And how does the plan need to be structured so that you get something usable? We want to have that practical strategy that is a basis for decision making and a reference for accountability, which is critical. Because one of the things that a solid strategy will do, remember, it's decision making. If we go with orchestration as the basis for strategy and the decisions that executives are making, when you have that usable basis, it also can become an accountability measure for why was that decision made? We're feeling a lot of stress right now in our organization. How have the recent decisions aligned with our strategy and with our intentions? And so they give you a lot of opportunity to consider the world through a variety of different lenses. So that when you're doing that, you end up with a strategic framework that really guides the organization forward in a variety of different ways. And so with this, we see the strategic framework at the middle, that strategy, that documented distillation. And then you can see in the circles around the outer ring how it finds its way into other documents or other aspects of your organizational operations. So for instance, we talked about that strategic plan finding its way into an implementation plan that might take it from a 3 to 5 year period to a 1 to 3 year implementation period. That then you can also see how that strategy becomes reflected in your dashboard, and that organizational dashboard being the visual reference of the metrics that matter for moving the mission. And so that may pull from the implementation plan. It might pull from key aspects of your strategy, and is a one-page reference that executives can use to ensure that the right decisions are being made and the right progress is being achieved along the way. Also, looking at content calendars, this is a tool for boards of directors or also for work teams that meet on a recurrent basis. What a content calendar allows you to do is look at the strategy or the strategic framework you have in place and then think about, all right, over the course of the next 12 months, for instance, if we meet 10 times during the 12 months in these January, February, March, July, August, September, December, then you can actually map your content based upon your strategy, because you know what you're supposed to be acting on, what you're supposed to be accomplishing, and you can have check-ins that link the work back to your strategy. Another great way strategy finds its way throughout an organization is by having it integrated into performance expectations. So earlier we referenced the strategic plan coming to an implementation plan, to a project plan, and to that important individual work plan, so that an individual can see how they're moving the larger picture forward for the organization. Weaving strategic concepts into your performance expectations is a great way to keep that front and center for people when they're going through those performance discussions and annual reviews of what progress they've made and how they've performed in advancing the organization's mission, vision, and values. A strategy is also important for informing a work group structure. So again, whether that is structuring what type of work groups are needed, or perhaps structuring the representation on a specific work group, your strategy will guide you. Because if a strategy, you've taken the time to think clearly and concisely about who the audience is, who the stakeholders are, that might influence who you put on that specific work group. A large part of organizational strategy comes down to identifying the strengths and the offsets that are with the people in your organization, so you know who you need to put into a specific work group together to achieve a much better outcome as an organization. And that ties in with the resource allocations as well, so that a successful strategy is helping you say no. It's helping you to prioritize. It's also helping you to figure out, should this resource allocation be in the hundreds or the thousands? How high is that on our list, and what sort of effect is it going to have? Another critical component is thinking about how successful organizations blend two types of thinking. So we've talked a lot this afternoon about strategic thinking, strategy. And there is also the complement that is the tactical thinking. And a successful organization is going to blend tactical and strategic thinking. Because if you have one side without the other, you can end up in a very unproductive situation. For if you have only tactical thinking, you may be missing that bigger picture. You may be missing the big risk that's on the horizon that could overall damage the organization or hinder its overall effectiveness. But if you only have strategy without tactical thinking, then you're missing that implementation piece of it. And so it's taking the overlap between the opportunities and the issues, considerations for the mites, and how is that big picture affecting us, thinking and loving possibilities, matching that up with thinking that then says, all right, we have all of these things we could do. Our strategy is going to focus us on the ones we need to do now. How can we then separate our issues and opportunities, think about them differently to know what is happening with our organization? What specifically do we need to check off and get done in a very sequential or linear fashion, so that we can mark our progress and see how we're filling in information that we need or finding answers. Because again, the simplicity that we crave in tactical thinking is the backbone of a successful strategy. And so ensuring that the successful organization is really blending that thinking. So then if we're thinking strategy, Then it's about advancing our own thinking. And what we're going to do in the next section of the webinar is go through some questions, sets of different questions that you can ask and consider so that in essence, what you're doing is advancing your own thinking in order to advance the thinking of your work team or your organization or others with which you're involved. And the critical component is that if we get answers up front, then we can frame our intent when it comes to forming the strategy. For instance, it's important to know who's going to champion the effort. Whatever the effort might be, you're going to need a champion. And when it's a strategy, you're going to need an executive champion. You need someone with influence over resources and someone who can make those decisions. And what we know about finding the champion is that they're not always the logical person up the chain. You may have the support and endorsement of the executive director or the program director. But for your specific initiative, you might actually need a champion that is the development director. Because with what you want to accomplish, you might need a different perspective or a different kind of influence over the process and how things will move forward. So you need to know who's going to champion that effort. How much time will people have to actually give to the effort? When we talked more about that pace and going back to the process and what do people need to succeed, up front, you need to be clear on how much time are people going to need to engage and how much time are they actually going to have to give, because often they can be different. Another critical consideration is thinking about how dynamics are going to influence the process. Strategy is about people. It's about relationships. It's about processes and systems, all of which bring out dynamics. And so a good strategist and successful strategy will understand what could influence the process, have the possibilities identified, and then be prepared to figure out solutions for enhancing that dynamic as the process unfolds. Another critical question with any strategy development and really any strategic effort is knowing what resources are available to support that effort, and specifically financial resources. This is important because a lot of times what you'll see is organizations or nonprofits wanting to advance their strategic thinking, but not being clear about whether or not they have financial resources to help do that. And the financial resources can go for things not just for consultants like me who can come in with the process, but also they could go for training and development to build the skills within the organization. They could go to things like snacks and room fees because you want to have this strategy development off-site and you want to nourish people and get them a little excited and feel valued. So needing to know what those financial resources are is very important up front. Also having that, when notions, what's all about timing. If we think on orchestration and what the conductor is doing with an orchestra, they have all of these amazing instruments out there in various levels doing various things, and they have to know when each group needs to move, when they need to come in, when they need to go out, when they need to be together, and when they need to be done and cut off. And so you need to have that answer up front. What are the timelines that are driving the overall plan and the engagement? Also critical up front to know how are you going to use whatever information is that's gleaned. So if you're developing a strategy to orchestrate a new program or a new direction for your organization, if you're gathering information from your stakeholders, know upfront how you're going to use the resulting insights that you get, and then act upon them accordingly. And another critical question, perhaps the most critical question to have answered upfront for any strategy: why are we doing this? What is driving our need or our desire to have a new strategy in place for our organization? And to really spend time and be honest about why you're going to pursue the initiative, because it's going to take time, it's going to take effort, it will be a change, which is going to spark a transition that for some people will be challenging. And so really getting your intentions clear up front allows you to make better decisions so that ultimately your actions and your impression are aligned. And then there are those discovery components that you can make along the way and in process. So I say this in-process discovery will frame the actions. If we know the intent, what we have in terms of our resources, our constraints, our why questions, now we need to think about the action and the information we're actually pulling together. And so some good questions to ask when gathering information for that strategy orchestration is, what's the landscape in which we find ourselves? So as a nonprofit organization, to think about it from a geographic landscape, perhaps from a sector perspective, where does the organization fit in this world and what's happening around it? It's not enough to just know, oh, our landscape, we're in Dane County, Wisconsin. Well, what's happening in the landscape and the topography of Dane County, Wisconsin, that is ultimately going to affect what you can do? Because if you know that landscape, then the next component is to start to think about your position in that landscape. With everything that's going on, how are you positioned amidst that topography? What do you know about how you're positioned in that landscape and how? And so that if you know where you're positioned, you can start to explore possibilities. Strategic thinking, again, is about those possibilities and knowing what are our options. And so that starts to be a bit of that ideation that gets people excited and they think, oh, big ideas, that strategy. It's part of the process. So knowing your options will allow you to then start the reductionist or the simplification process of what really matters. And I will suggest that this may be some of the more challenging parts of the conversation, is when you're expected to go, all right, we know these are our options, these are the things before us. Now, what is it really? What's the one thing? What's the most important thing? What could be the most disastrous to our mission? What could give us the greatest boost for how we want to lead forth community impact in our world? So what really matters, and being very repetitive about that until you get it down to that true kernel. Because once you have that kernel, you've gone through your options, you know where you're positioned in this landscape, it's time to think about the who, and who will make or break our success. And to get as specific as possible as you can when you think about that is critical. Because who will make or break our success, if you just say employees, it doesn't give you much to work with from an orchestration perspective. But if you're able to say who's going to make or break our success will be our frontline workers who are interacting directly with our clients in this specific way, it gives you more to work with, gives you more insight, more opportunity to know then how you can create a value proposition for those specific people so that they care and they understand the value and you can deliver on that value for them. So getting very specific in the who, and then again, addressing the milestones, the timing. When do we need to act? What is it about that landscape and your position in the landscape and who you need to engage in the process that's going to drive when you need to start taking action on your strategy? So that when you know how it's going to make or break it, when do you need to act, then it's about maximizing priorities. Again, we said a successful strategy is one that will help you say no. It's one that will help you figure out how to allocate resources and make clear, consistent decisions. And so spending time to think about maximizing priorities is critical. Because if we know then how you intend to maximize your priorities, you can look at your resources. And again, we're looking at financial resources, human resources, your social resources, your networks, and your intellectual resources, the expertise that you may have, the expertise that you may need to acquire in order to maximize that priority in a timely fashion to influence your critical stakeholders. And then as you get that, start to have that plan into your strategy and you're ready to move toward more action, critical to think about, how do we avoid trivia? These are the little things that get in the way. So it might be, understanding first, what are the trivia? What are the things that are distracting us, that are going to get in the way? And then how can we avoid them? What specific decisions can we make? What things can we put in place so that we can avoid that trivia? And that is a key component to masterful strategy, is identifying that trivia and really putting decisions and resources in place to avoid it. So some more techniques for successful strategy. This is where you're starting to look at the small dedicated groups. And with this, it's looking at devising a strategy with a core team. It's really hard to focus on all of the components and distill things down in a way that benefits the organization when you have too many cooks in the kitchen. So really find that small dedicated group, and it might be that you have a core team that is then gathering information from other dedicated groups so that you're allowing people to benefit from small group dynamics so that they will contribute their ideas, and you're also able to do it in a way that's feeding information into a core team and through a defined process. Another technique is to ensure that you do have that down the road focus. So if it is a strategic framework for your organization, it's that 3 to 5 years. Even for some projects, a key for successful strategy, you may be working your way through implementation of new financial controls in your organization, which feels like a very here and now responsive thing that needs to be done for the organization's longevity. But a down the road focus in discerning those internal controls or those financial controls will have you thinking about what are the implications for this on systems 5 years from now, on this vision that we've put in place for our organization, or some of the constraints that we feel that we have. Successful strategy also involves data. And so whether that's statistical reviews, looking back at trend information for your programs and services, having those stakeholder inquiries, so interviews, ways of gathering information, that a successful strategy is going to be built from a broader perspective. There's also a technique for successful strategy that's about integrated discovery sessions. Again, when we think about that process where we find strategy in the middle, we know that that starts with an idea. Someone has an idea and they want to move on it. And so bringing multiple perspectives into one room and having them work through a process of discovery about that idea. So it's not just the brainstorming, but it's also that planning and the distillation and the discernment so that ultimately you can get to a commitment on what decisions are critical for moving the organization forward. And in those discovery sessions and in your processes, important to start with what I call the ideology opener and to include an artistic endeavor. So the ideology opener is ensuring that your strategy is grounded in your ideology, your mission, vision, or your values. And so that might be having the mission statement up on a board and having people react to how they feel about it. How clear is it? How relevant do they think it is? You might pull up the values for your organization and use that as the basis for setting ground rules for your discussions. So that again, you're grounding it in the purpose and the ideology for the organization. Successful strategy development, we also include this artistic endeavor because we know that people will think differently and respond differently when they use different aspects of their brain. And so one of the fun things to do is to give people crayons and have them take notes in crayons. It takes us back to a time when we were more curious, typically, and gives us that opportunity to exercise a different tactile feeling and really move things forward in a different way, so that we can bring things forward and expand our thinking. And then once we've been able to do all of that, having those determined timelines and lead parties is really critical. Again, we talk a lot about when do we need to act, by whom, how can we orchestrate things. Accountable strategy will involve those timelines and lead parties. Another question that often comes up is about when, in terms of doing strategy. When do you do this, and how frequently do you do strategy and think about it? And I would suggest for some of us, we're doing it all the time. And the way that is successful is when you're doing it all the time for different types of initiatives or different organizations. Again, we go back to that need for blended thinking between the practical and the strategic. You can't be constantly in strategy mode within the same organization focusing on the same things, because often what that can do is create some disruptive change as opposed to productive. And so what you would look to do is to refresh your major strategic thinking or your strategy every 3 to 5 years. It's because what we're seeing is that's a good typical time cycle for when the landscapes are really shifting. And so that's the key. Every 3 to 5 years when things are going along, if you have a disruption on the landscape, that's a time to revisit your strategy. And so refreshing every 3 to 5 years, or as created by something that happened. Reviewing it annually. As we said earlier, change is constant. And so making sure that you're reviewing that strategy, what decisions you've been making. And it's not just reviewing the strategy for its currency and its relevance, but successful strategy is also reviewing how your actions over the past year have really moved the strategy forward in the way that you intended to move it forward. And then really to reference it monthly, for some organizations quarterly. But again, you want to keep that strategy alive and really connected at the individual level. And so having a monthly reference can be a great way to keep the strategy alive and to advance your own strategic thinking even further. And we've all seen cartoons that bring forward the concept of it. And in this cartoon, looking at it, what we see, we have some folks who are in charge. We have some human resources being put in space to row the boat forward. And what we also see is we see a lot of likeness being lumped here. Our two folks who are looking out over the front of the boat, looks like same sort of folks. You'll see on the right-hand side of the boat, left-hand side of the boat. And the strange feeling erupts that you're going in circles when your resources are misaligned, when your perspectives are not mixed and there isn't that diversity in how you're using those resources and that balance. So the balance between, the beauty and the brawn, the balance between the practical and the strategic thinking, all of those components come into play for successful strategy. And it's important when we think about this to be reflecting it throughout the work. And so with that, what this mental model points out is that you have a traditional basis for decision making with how you're going about setting that foundation for your organizational intent. So at the decision making level, you have your ideology, your mission, vision, values, your strategic direction, which are those goals, the objectives, your champions, an implementation map that then is going to show your actions and your resources and timelines, ending with your progress reports, your monitoring work, your surveys, your check-ins, how's it going and what needs to adapt. So that's all happening at more of the organizational or operational level. And then the beauty of a connected strategy is that that is being reflected in your platform for communication. So your ideology, your purpose and your legacy is then being reflected in your brand framework. Your name, your logos, your fonts, your standards, how are you reflecting your identity in the very look of your organization? In the same way that when you know what you want to accomplish with whom, how is your messaging strategy connecting with your stakeholders? So if your intent is to accomplish certain things, how are you communicating with the people involved to connect with them and to compel them toward the impression that you desire? Similar implementation mapping are those exactly what are we going to need to do operationally to make this happen is reflected in your integrated outreach. So how are we actually reaching our stakeholders or influencing their impression of us, or perhaps the actions that they're taking on behalf of our mission and our desired intent? And then progress reports that are happening operationally are then also being coupled with your assessments and your audits about the impression that you're making with your stakeholders and in the broader community. And so this is one example to show how a solid strategy is really integrating throughout your organization. And it's a great opportunity to keep things simple and consistently focused. A lot of information about successful strategy and covered a variety of different hills and valleys on the landscape here. So would encourage anyone who has curiosities or desired clarifications about anything that I shared here today during this webinar, or if there were things that you wanted to get out of today's session, this is your time. We do have a few moments left here together. So go in, get that keyboard ready, type in the chat, have those questions come through, and we'll offer up curiosities or clarifications as you move into your 1 o'clock hour Central Time. And while you're making your way to the keyboard or forming that question, I'll just add a bit of commentary until some of the questions come in about 3 areas specifically in the nonprofit realm where you'll see a lot of activity related to strategy. So for instance, there is governance, strategic planning, and branding. We talked a bit about the branding platform or that consistent communication. We've certainly spent a lot of time on strategic planning concepts, but there's also the governance piece. And the beauty within the nonprofit arena, when you have a strong intent guiding your governance, guiding your strategic planning, and guiding your brand development, you really have opportunities to integrate and clarify your strategy even further. And so it is important to think about all of these 3 components as processes. And really governance is your process for maximizing resources. You know, we said that a successful strategy will help you make good decisions about how you're moving the organization forward. So the governance is that opportunity for the leadership and for the executives on the board to really inquire about how we're doing what we said we were going to do. And related to governance, one of the questions that will come up has to do with the review of missions, vision, and values, and whether or not we believe that a mission, vision, and values should be reevaluated every 3 to 5 years. I believe that your mission, vision, and values should really be examined on an ongoing basis. And by that, I don't mean that you need to rewrite your mission statement every year. That can be confusing for people, but it's more looking at, has there been a change in the landscape? Has there been a shift in our stakeholders? Is there some external or internal situation that might change how we do what we do? And that's the point, that they should be truly reevaluated as opposed to reviewed. For some organizations, their mission statements are relevant and lasting for decades. For others, because things have changed so dramatically, they need to be revisited. I do believe that for vision statements, those provide greater benefit to the organization when they're time bound. And so by that, it would be your vision is looking at, what do we want to accomplish for the organization over the next 5 years? And that brings in a strategic view and a sense of timing for what the organization wants to accomplish. So your vision actually becomes a strategic filter for all of your decision making. So that will be, doesn't necessarily need to trigger on a 3 to 5 year basis, but definitely review them. Also to review those values if you have an influx or a sudden change in the people who are doing the work, because we know that language changes, values shift. So something that was meaningful a few years ago may not be any longer, or it may need to be tweaked in definition because different generations use different language when they think about what governs their actions. So keep those questions coming in through the chat. In the meantime, we'll pull back to the strategic planning process. And again, thinking about that from a strategy, it's about allocating resources and figuring out how to guide implementation in a way that branding is a process for creating unique names and images, and its consistency. So again, thinking about all of these components as processes driven by intent allows you to start connecting those dots. And that is an underlying theme for successful strategy. It's about orchestration, connecting dots, and helping people move things forward. Questions often come up about the consultant and bringing someone in. Really, you need to ask yourself why you're doing it. And you also need to ask very specific questions for the consultant, specifically for nonprofit work, because there are different motivations and different components. So looking at that and knowing that that was the brief glimpse into successful strategy. Coming up in June, we'll have a leadership development around baseline budgeting concepts, improving our financial literacy. So I would encourage all of you to go forth, reflect on your own intentions as an organization or for your project. How can you engage your stakeholders and continue to build successful strategy? So thank you for joining us here on May 20th, May 19th. I hope that you're having a good spring and that you will have a very successfully strategic month ahead. Thank you.